Did you know that the Union Government of India is among the most understaffed in the world? The ratio of employees to 1,000 citizens is 16 for India, whereas it is 5 times that number for the United States and 10 times in Scandinavian countries. Did you know that in the last decade, India was able to lift 415 million people out of poverty and bank over 500 million people? Hello and welcome to another edition of Capital Calculus. I am your host, Anil Padmanabhan. The most favored metric to assess any union budget, and we have one coming up in less than a month from now, is the amount of funds the government is able to earmark for social welfare. Yes, this is very important, but equally, if not more important, is the ability of the government, whether it's the state or the union government, to deliver on its targets. This, in turn, is linked to a government's governance capacity. In the past, India has failed abysmally on this count, primarily because it has lacked governance capacity. However, in the last 10 years, things have turned around with the government using technology to deliver public good at a staggering scale. Now, a new book has just hit the stands called Accelerating India's Development, which argues precisely this, that the way forward for India is only through a marked improvement in its governance capacity. To unpack the insights of this book, some of which could serve as a blueprint for action for the new government, which coincidentally has taken charge at the center, I spoke to its author, Karthik Muralidharan. He's a professor of economics at the University of California, San Diego, and someone who's deeply familiar with the Indian economy and the functioning of both the state and union governments. I began by asking Karthik to elaborate on the central thesis of his book, the mantra of improving governance capacity both at the state and the level of the union government.
I think, one of the key points of the book is that most of our policy discourse focuses on budget allocation and what sectors the government should prioritize. Okay, so should you do more infrastructure? Should you do more health? Should you do more education? But a key point of the book is to argue that the translation of spending into outcomes is so poor, regardless of what sector you're spending on. And therefore, when I say investing in governance and state capacity, what I broadly mean is invest. So think about that as kind of there is a black box that is the government into which you put money and you get some output. But basically, the return on investment on investing in improving the effectiveness of the government is going to be much higher than simply improving the top line of expenditure. So the analogy I use in the book is that think about the Indian state like a 1950s ambassador car. Okay, so just like the ambassador car was a metaphor for pre-liberalization economy, it's similarly a good metaphor for the functioning of the state itself. So putting more money is a bit like putting more fuel in a 1950s car, right? So it will help travel a little bit, but the translation of fuel budget into distance traveled is going to be very weak unless you upgrade the car itself. So that's kind of broadly the core point of the book. And then I spend a lot of this is backed by research and evidence. And then the book then discusses not just what we need to do, but how we need to do it.
So Karthik, just staying with your analogy about the ambassador car, like you said, you have to keep putting in more fuel to get mileage. So similarly, the political system, like you point out in your book, is invested in an ambassador car because a broken governance system suits them. So what's the incentive for any political party to invest in creating the state capacity which you so need?
Correct. And see, it's a very good question. And I think a key point of what I argue is that it is not that the political class does not want an effective state. Okay. It is just that normally the returns to doing that take time to show up. And so the short-term political incentive is always to announce new schemes so that, that's what gets the attention. So like I say, it's easier to build new schools and take pictures of opening ceremonies than it is to make sure that teachers are showing up and kids are actually learning. Okay. So it's not that the politicians politicians don't want the state to deliver. Okay, so the reason I'm optimistic is that if you look at kind of the data on elections in general, it looks like for a long time, for 30, 50 years after independence, there wasn't much correlation between performance and election outcomes. But, it's increasingly clear that while there is an old politics of identity, caste, community, religion, region, language, there is a new politics of governance and service delivery. Okay, so the older politics gets you about 20% of the vote, but that's not enough to win. Okay, so increasingly to win, you need to deliver, which means that the politicians are also interested. The problem is that because the politicians are like the driver of this car, right? But the job that you need requires kind of engineers and mechanics to re-engineer the car itself. So part of the point of the book is to provide a roadmap of how to do this, given that, it's the politicians who ultimately benefit from having a more effective car.
So, Karthik, just staying on this point. So now, if you need to kind of build on this, the state capacity, so can you share some examples of cause and effect of actually, instances in India where governments or political establishments have bothered to invest in state capacity?
Yeah, so I think there's a wide set of examples, right? And I think in general, so one excellent example of the past 10, 15 years is Aadhaar and digital public infrastructure, right? And that's also a very good example of the changing political incentives. Okay, so historically, one of the reasons there used to be leakage and corruption in welfare programs is that leakage was an important source of creating patronage and funding your intermediaries, who would then come back and support you. Okay, but the political calculation has changed that the benefits to improving service delivery for large numbers of people are now kind of exceeding the costs of the lost rents that you would get from those intermediaries. Okay, so I think the entire Aadhaar and digital public infrastructure and DBT is an excellent example of investments in state capacity that seem to both be benefiting citizens and also delivering political returns. Now, of course, the voters have high standards, so one set of investments can get you one electoral cycle, and then you need to deliver more. Okay, so another example I point out to, for example, is the case of Telangana. And we'll talk a little bit more about staffing later, right? But in general, one of the key problems of the Indian state is that we don't have enough frontline workers, but the ones you have are not accountable enough. Okay, so the government of Telangana had this really novel approach of hiring, say, 10,000 new panchayat secretaries. But the key was that they were hired on a 3-year contract with performance being measured and then regularization happening partly on the basis of that. And one measure of success here is that Telangana, I think, won over 35 to 40% of all national Panchayati Raj awards, even though it was only 5% of the population, and the center was kind of a different political party. So, there are lots of examples like that of actually governments investing in governance and state capacity that are delivering meaningful impacts for citizens.
But Karthik, on the other side of this, we also see the embedded stakeholders of this rental incomes, as it were, pushing back. Aratyas of Punjab and Haryana are an example, the way they've organized protest against the new farm laws. So this trade-off is an ongoing debate, and you believe that it is tilting in favor of the reformers.
See, I think every single issue requires its own kind of coalition, okay, that you need to put together to make happen. I think the farm reforms are way more complex, partly because, there is also a trust deficit, okay, because it is, if you frame the reforms as partly being driven by fiscal considerations, then people get suspicious. So farm reforms are among the most difficult we have. It is one of the hardest problems we face as a country, right? Because you've got to get the economics right, you've got to get the politics right, you've got to get the distribution right, and you have to get the trust right. Okay, so personally, like for example, I think most economists will agree that policies like free electricity for farmers are among the worst policies we have as a country, because they're bad for equity and they're bad for efficiency, right? Most of those benefits go to the top 5% or 10% of landholders, and we know it's bad for cropping patterns, bad for environment, bad in water table sustainability. But because you are used to a particular way of doing things, those reforms get very difficult. So personally, I think, the approach for something like farm sector reforms is going to have to be, you may need an approach like GST almost, right, where you have kind of you have a council of center and state where you kind of have a discussion of what needs to happen, maybe pass some constitutional guarantees that there will be adequate compensation. So it's a very complex issue that requires getting both the economics and the politics and also the trust right.
Okay, staying on your book, one very counterintuitive claim you have made in it. You're saying that the Indian government is actually understaffed. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, so I think, the numbers are very clear. Okay, so if you look at a simple measure of public employees per capita, India has one of the fewest in the world. Okay, so we have about 16 employees per thousand citizens, compared to, in Scandinavian countries it's about 10 times higher. Okay, and even a country like the US, that we think of as a paragon of free markets and no government, like actually, and less government, has nearly 5 times as many employees per capita. Okay, so and if you look at the variation across Indian states, again, Bihar has about 3, UP has about 6, and Tamil Nadu has about 14. And so it's not an accident that you get much better service delivery, like, in the states that have higher levels of staffing. Okay. So I think the core story of Indian public sector employment is that at the very high end, people are underpaid relative to the market opportunity cost of kind of the top talent in the government. Okay, but for the vast majority of government employees, the salary is multiple times higher than the private sector equivalent. So the one sentence summary of public sector personnel in India is that you pay too much and hire too few. Okay, so what you need to be doing is actually slowing down the growth of pay and actually hiring a lot more people. Okay. And it's also a good chance to make a connection of kind of, which people don't often connect, the structure of public sector labor markets to our unemployment problem. Okay, so people often say, I have 100 applicants for every government job. The private sector is not creating enough jobs. And that's completely getting it upside down. Okay, the private sector is creating jobs, but the private sector will create jobs at market conditions, at market terms. It's the government that is overpaying so much relative to the market wage, okay, that you get this 100 plus applicants for every government job, but that also has a massive negative spillover on skilling and jobs. So, for example, one study shows that over 80% of educated youth in Tamil Nadu who are unemployed because they're studying for government exams. Okay, so 80%, right? So, which means that the structure of public sector labor markets is so distorted that that is not only directly hurting state capacity because you're not able to hire enough, but it's also indirectly hurting the economy because you're kind of distorting the education system. So why do we produce kind of rote learning, exam taking kind of students who don't have any real skills? And that's because the most lucrative employer in the economy is the government, and the most lucrative employer demands exam taking skills and not actual skills. Correct? So that is then shapes the entire labor market. And so this is something I elaborate on a fair bit in the book.
Which is a nice segue into our next segment, which is on vote bank politics. You do allude to it substantively in one of the chapters. My question is that in the just concluded general election, particularly in Uttar Pradesh, we saw a kind of pushback which against this, the Labharti-driven lure for electoral votes. It's actually emerged as a new electoral currency compared to the traditional fault lines of caste and religion. So there was some kind of pushback, and the BJP faced reverses. Of course, no vote is decided on one single factor, but I'm purely pointing to trends. So how do you see vote bank politics evolving in this new face-off that we have seen, in a new kind of electoral currency called Labhartis, or beneficiaries of targeted social welfare spending?
Yeah, so if anything, what I would argue is that the Labharti vote is absolutely is real, and Labhartis in general are a broader constituency than kind of narrow caste vote banks. Okay, so the pessimistic way of saying this is that, oh, caste and all of these vote banks are still alive. The optimistic way of saying this is that even when you're focusing on caste and vote banks, you are now having to construct broader coalitions. Okay, so even when you look at what say this Samajwadi Party did, it it was kind of expanding the caste coalition beyond the narrow Muslim Yadav kind of, coalition, to say that it would be a broader coalition of underprivileged groups. Okay. Now, and I think, but the point is, when you have a broad coalition, then the old politics of just saying narrow things like reservation don't work anymore, because that's not going to deliver enough benefits compared to delivering better services at scale. So improving the effectiveness of the state is how you're going to deliver at scale. And and to be fair, I think, like, if you look at the previous UP state election, I think the re-election of the state government was in some part, at least, because of improved service delivery, reduced kind of leakage in getting PDS, etc. I think the challenge is that the standards keep going up, right? So the UPA got re-elected once with NREGA, okay, but then for the second election, you need to come up with something new, okay. So one way to say this in UP is that the Labharthi kind of vote did work, but it worked for the first election. But then for the next one, voters are looking for more. So which means that, you got to, like, the political class constantly has to keep upping its game with regard to kind of, just delivering more for voters. And the book offers a long set of ideas that, that political leaders can work with.
In fact, just to add to what you said, the Labharthi vote, we have not drilled into the gender part. Most of these basics that have been provided, whether it's cooking gas, banking, electricity, drinking water, and so on, impact women. And in the 22 election, which you referred to, the UP re-election, 50% of the women voted for BJP, of the voter turnout. So there's a new constituency of women, which is not driven necessarily by caste and religion, but by the principle of state capacity that you argue.
Exactly, right? And I think many of the ideas, for example, I think one of the simplest things based on evidence that the government should do is just kind of hire an extra Anganwadi worker, across the country, right? That's 1 million jobs right there. They're all jobs for women. It'll improve health. It'll improve child health, child education, and women's empowerment, and potentially improve female labor force participation if you manage to provide more reliable childcare. And it is incredibly cost effective. So, there's a lot of low hanging fruit here, for governments to work with.
Okay. Finally, Karthik, is India's cup half full or half empty?
So, I think if you, again, in chapter 10, I give India like my grade of India over 75 years is a solid B plus. Okay. And I think it's so, there is so much to be proud of. Okay. And I think there's this old story about India that everything that is true, the opposite is also true. Okay. And that's because when you have a 1.4 billion person population, you can tell whatever story you want by where in the distribution you're sampling. Okay. So I think in the grand scheme of things, we have a lot to be proud of, right? Indian democracy is a marvel. We are one of the fastest growing large economies in the world. We've delivered and if you look at that regression line of human development outcomes conditional on GDP per capita, you are exactly on that line. Okay. And in some ways slightly better. Okay. So which is why I think the grade is a solid B plus. But B plus also means can do better. Okay. And so the whole point of the book is to say, it's neither saying, oh, rara, we are great and we are destined to 21st century is going to be India's, or neither are you kind of saying, oh my God, we've got all of these kind of, enormous challenges and like, what are we going to do? And one of the things is I don't like predicting too much because the future depends on what we do. Okay. And so a core part of the book is to say over the next 25 years, whether it's the prime minister, whether it's chief ministers, people have set grand targets and that's wonderful. But as we see, like in, I think James Clear's Atomic Habits, that success is not just about the goal. Success depends on building effective systems and the systems and consistently implementing those systems.
In true style of a professor and an academic, Karthik has given India a B+. 75 years on, indeed, it has a lot to be proud about. But at the same time, there's enormous potential for it to improve. This, in turn, is linked to its ability to undertake systemic reforms to ramp up governance capacity in the country. Indeed, in the last 10 years, India has been able to do this, to use technology to deliver public good at scale. As I mentioned in the introduction, it was able to lift 415 million people out of poverty and bank 500 million people. While this should be a source of inspiration, it should not be a source of complacency too. food for thought? Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to StratNews Global on YouTube. Hit the bell icon so that you don't miss any updates. And please to share your thoughts, ideas and suggestions with us. I'm available on Twitter at Capital Calculus. I'll be back next week with another episode. Till then, stay safe.